You may be seated. Well, it is wonderful to be with you all here this morning, although my heart joins you in grief at the passing of Linda. And so just to acknowledge that as a community, we have lost somebody very dear and very important to us. And so to remember her with our hearts and to remember her family as well as we talk about the good news of Jesus Christ and the redemptive power of his gospel. Amen. So this morning, I have the opportunity to preach on the Transfiguration, which I'm sorry, is a very mysterious verse. What exactly was seen in that moment is not entirely known. And yet, we pastors and priests like to muddle through it and pretend like we know exactly what's happening here. And so bear with me in that. But to get into this, we're continuing on with our theme that Sarah and I have been going back and forth with, which is the names of Jesus, or the personalities of Jesus, and different ways that first century world understood him. And so we've talked about Jesus as light. Sarah tackled the very challenging mystic approach with Jesus as word and wisdom last week, and I'll be continuing on this morning as Jesus beloved. But to talk about beloved, that's a word that we can understand, one who is the object of another's love. The context of the word, however, is a little bit deeper, and so to explore that, we're going to go back into the Old Testament and spend some time there. So remember that Jesus enters into the world during the first century. It's a Jewish world, and as he does, he's entering into a people, a community, that understood that there was a brokenness within and throughout all of creation, and that God was stepping into the heart of that brokenness to heal it from the inside out. And that God was committed to that. We go back to the poetry of Genesis 1, for example, when we read that on the 6 days of creation and then on the day of rest, it would say that God saw, and God saw, and God said, "Behold, it is good." And the Hebrew word is tov. It's a very, very powerful and very important word. And what it's connoting is this understanding that when God said it is good, it is as God intended it to be. It is full. It is thorough, it is complete, and yet it's dynamic in that it's meant to not stop there, but to continue and move forward. And so there's a brokenness within that, and through the use of poetry and of legend and of history and beautiful sets of narrative, we have this redemptive story that depicts that brokenness, but then, of course, that God makes covenant with a community of people, the Israelites, right, the Hebrews. And so God goes back, makes a covenant with sort of the founding father of this whole family, Abraham. And this covenantal language that we have is that God says to Abraham, I will bless you. I will bless you with a family. And through that family, your family will bless all the families of the world. Or I will bless you as a nation. And through that nation, all of the nations of the world shall be blessed. And so it's within this story that Jesus steps. But it's a story that's fraught with just tumultuous ups and downs as the people of God strive to embody their half of this covenant about what it means to embody God's people, serving purposefully as a catalyst through which God will bring blessing to the broken world. It's fraught with ups and downs and failures and lack of identity again and again and again. And yet, as we see throughout this narrative, God says again to the people, "You are my beloved. You are my beloved." But it's not a cul-de-sac term. It's not meant to sort of stop there, that the action of the word stops with them, as if they were some kind of like direct object in a sense. Instead, it was meant to be understood as not as a cul-de-sac, but as a catalyst, right? That through you my music will be played, through you my healing will come, through you my words, my blessing will come. And so as we step into the story, we also recognize that failure. We have entered into a period of about 700 years of exile before Jesus comes on site. The northern kingdom, Israel, has been sacked time and time again by various tribes, various nations, from Alexander the Great to Egypt, just again and again, while the southern kingdom, of course, is conquered by the Babylonians. Jerusalem is completely turned over. The temple is completely destroyed, and the people are carted off into Babylon. And it's almost like just episode after episode of Game of Thrones, if you will, in this world. Just tragedy after tragedy, death, loss, and darkness, and the people again and again and again are crying out to God, "How long, O Lord, how long?" 700 years of this. And so out of the people come the voices of the prophets who are saying, one will come to represent the Lord, a Mashiach, a Messiah will come and will take all that has been twisted and bent and will make it right again. And so the image around this person was that of like a warrior king who had prophetic gifts as well. And so they would talk about Moses, they would talk about Elijah, they would talk about David. And they talked about this one coming and restoring the glory days of the kingdom, where Israel would be sort of placed back on top to be the light of the nations and guide the rest of the people. So when Jesus enters this world, they are waiting. They are looking with great expectations. And Jesus by no means is alone in claiming messiahship. In and around Jesus' lifetime, there were several individuals who came forth claiming to be the Messiah. And all of these other messiahs or would-be messiahs came forth as the figure of a warrior king, of a conqueror, one who would lead the people against the Romans, who were sort of the powerhouse of their day. And they began minting coins, they began to build up the army, and they began utilizing these ancient prophetic verses to legitimize their claim to messiahship. So Jesus comes on scene and has a very different message. And in the chapter just before this, in Matthew 16, he's with his disciples and he looks at them and he says, "Who do people say that I am? Or who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Which is a Messiah title. Everybody's wondering, everybody's asking these questions. In Jesus' day, there were, just to kind of simplify it down, there were three sort of major social and religious political powerhouses. Much like we are sort of split and divided by political parties, we have our Republicans, we have our Democrats, and we have sort of the libertarians in a sense. We have in Jesus' day the Pharisees, who were incredibly conservative, sect that believed that by adhering to Torah, by reaching back into the glory days, by embracing who they were as the covenant community, or their understanding of what it meant to be the covenant community, at many times at the exclusion of others, including those within themselves that were marginalized, that they would, in a sense, create conditions that would be ready for the Messiah to actually come. So out of that sect, the Zealots, if you've heard of the Zealots, that were sort of like the alt-right in a sense. They were very militant, militia-like, and they would do these hit-and-run sort of terrorist operations against the Romans, believing that through their zealousness, through their devotion, that they were willing to sacrifice their lives for this cause, that God would usher in this new kingdom. And you had the Sadducees, who were sort of the progressives of their day, where they were looking around and they were saying, all of this ancient approach to this way it should be abandoned, it should be left behind, it should be a thing of the past, and we should embrace, in a sense, a first century modernity, if you will. The Greek world was up and going underneath the Roman Empire, and enlightenment was the thing. And so they were saying, we've got to abandon these backwoods, ancient ways and embrace this enlightenment. And only then can we be a light to the nations. And so they said, we've got to reform, we've got to change, we've got to look upon our past for what it was, but in some ways treat it like metaphor and myth and something that we can grow from. And so the Sadducees and the Pharisees did not get along, if you can imagine. And so it's always interesting, too, when we read through the Gospels, whenever these individuals from these two different power sides, these political sides, would get together to try and entrap Jesus, the original hearers of this would have been like, what? Working together to actually ensnare Jesus. And then you had the Essenes, who were sort of the separatists. They were the ones who would live out in the desert, a very highly ascetic life, almost monk life, the desert fathers, if you will. And they would copy down the books, particularly Isaiah, and they would sort of celebrate who they were, but they understood that any sense of assimilation or any rubbing of elbows with the world of their times was strictly no-no. We've got to separate and completely go off into the desert on our own for the Messiah to come. So we don't really see them actually that much within the scope of the stories because they're off in the desert. But this is the world that every time these would-be messiahs would step into place, everybody's asking, well, who are you? Are you a Sadducee? Are you a Pharisee? Are you an Essenean? And Jesus steps on scene and says, I'm none of that. And this big, bold statement move that he makes is right there in the beginning of his ministries when this crazy guy from out in the wilderness steps forward, John the Baptist, who happens to be Jesus' cousin, is crying out, repent, repent, come and be baptized, which is his way of essentially saying, stop everything that you think that you've known, turn that over on its head, you're going in the wrong direction, is John's message. And he was not, obviously, very popular among these power groups of their day. And he's suggesting that people need to be baptized, that Israel needs to be baptized in a sense, which was a huge political statement of its own time because again, baptism was something that reached back into the Exodus story when the people left Egypt and passed through the waters of the sea. And then again, passing through the waters of the Jordan to enter into the promised land after the 40 years of traveling through the Exodus. And so in a sense, what John is saying is you have to be rebaptized. You have to pass through the waters again to embrace what it means to embody the covenant community. That to be ethnically Jewish isn't the direction, but instead it's that the true worshipers of God worship in spirit and in truth. And so this is John's message, and Jesus comes on scene and he goes in that direction. It's a repent. It's a shift. It's take everything you know and turn it on its head. And so in that moment, we know from the baptism stories, the same thing happens where the heavens open up and a voice comes down and says, this is my son, the beloved, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And so Jesus very quickly steps into action and takes on the images of his day where it was understood that heaven and earth were coming together, where God was actually interacting with the creation itself. If we are to understand Jesus as being both man and both God, the place where heaven and earth intersect, Jesus is identifying himself with these very well-known images, these very well-known symbols of his day, the symbols of temple, of Torah, wisdom and word, like we talked about last week, and spirit. And so Jesus embraces every time that Jesus heals, every time that Jesus teaches or does this public demonstration, like the woman that was caught in adultery a couple weeks ago when we studied Jesus' statement that I am the light of the world. They're not just parlor tricks of Jesus, but Jesus is actually showing and revealing the inbreaking reality of heaven on earth. Jesus is embodying that through his actions to say that this is a message and a movement of restoration, of hope, and of peace. The rebellions that are happening around Jesus are about violence, about war, about division, about walls, swords, and bloodshed. And Jesus says that is not the way of heaven. In fact, when Jesus says the powerful statements in the book of John, the Gospel of John, I am not of this world, that is what he's talking about. If I was of this world, then the angel armies would come down and this would be over. But my way is peace. My way is love. When enemies come and sit down at a table together, one-on-one in reconciliation, that is the way of heaven. So he's reinstituting how Israel has understood their story from the beginning. And he's recapitulating, or he's speaking again the story of Israel as well. Because as you read through the synoptic gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and into the story here, we see that Jesus is very poignantly taking that story and embodying himself. Just as the people in the Exodus left death and darkness from Egypt and passed through the sea to go into the wilderness for 40 years, right, of wandering and being tempted within the desert for how they understand their identity. Jesus comes before John and is baptized. He passes through the waters and goes into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted. And all those temptations are specifically about identity questions. Do we understand our identity as ones that have great power? or as ones who are able to take what we have and manipulate and the things that we can do, or do we understand it by the way that other people see us and how we are viewed within the eyes of the world? That was the temptation of Israel within the desert, and that was the temptation when we break down the questions that the Satan asks Jesus in the wilderness. That's that basic temptation that Jesus faces himself. But Jesus, unlike Israel's story, remembers who it is that he is. I'm the beloved. I'm the beloved. I am the one. I am taking Israel's story and I'm putting it on my shoulders and I am embodying it, so that the peace of God, the love of God, the healing of God can come into the broken world. And so when Jesus is with his disciples and he asks that question, who do people say that I am? The answers seem a little bit cryptic as to which side. It's all sort of symbolic about the way that the Sadducees would have seen him, the way that the Pharisees would have seen him, the way that the Essenes would have seen him. And then he says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter has that great line, well, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah. This is right, you are, Peter. On this truth I will build my church. And yet not long after, when he says that the Son of Man has come down to serve, to not be served, but that at the hands of man he will give up his life, Peter very quickly does what I think any really close friend would do, like far from it. 12 scrapping, fishermen and carpenters and all, we're going to protect you. Far from it, that will not happen. And yet Jesus looked at him and he says this really harsh, hardcore thing, get behind me, Satan. This is what he says. Get behind me, Satan, because that is an antithetical to what it is that God is doing. I always love to think about Peter as the disciple with a foot-shaped mouth. He just sort of speaks it out without really thinking of it first. But he's probably saying what all the rest of the guys do. And so in this scene, that sort of is a recapitulation, we had, last week we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is on the Mount, and the Sermon on the Mount is essentially Jesus' teaching on Torah. And he's taking it once again, and he's bringing about the understanding of again, what it means to be the catalyst through which God's love is enacted, is played out throughout the world. And so it's a recapitulated scene of Moses on the mountain receiving the law, and we have the same thing within this scene that harkens back to the First Testament, the Hebrew Testament reading that we did this morning, of Moses being on the mountain. And Jesus goes up, and he takes with him the sons of Zebedee, John and James, and Peter. I always think this is an interesting choice. They're kind of the inner three, if you will. And yet, it's interesting because James and John are the sons of Zebedee. They're also known as the sons of thunder. There are places in the Greek translation where it reads that. Because not long before this, they're passing through as they're walking throughout the countryside, and they're about to approach a village, and the village hears that Jesus is coming, and they want nothing to do with him. They're basically like, nope, stop. You're not welcome here, which is a huge breach of the hospitality codes. And so this tired crowd, or this tired group of men who've been walking all day, James and John get upset and once again speak for the whole group. Jesus, can we call fire down from heaven upon this village? So not quite getting the point, right? But like Elijah, can we call fire down from heaven? And of course, Peter has his episode, far from it, this will not happen, get behind me, Satan. So he takes these three individuals to the top of the mountain. And as they're there, he transfigures. We talk about thin places. We talk about places that we can go, much like Lake Tahoe, I think, is very much a thin place, where we can go and we can be reminded that the veil that separates heaven and earth is very, very thin. It's been made thin throughout the whole world, but there are places that we can go where we can experience that thinness. In this scene, Jesus reveals that Jesus himself is a thin place. But instead, like Moses, where the glory of God, the fire of God is shining, it's so bright that we know from the rest of the story that it brightens Moses' face, so much so that Moses' face begins to glow. It's from the outside down. This is from the inside out. That the light of heaven shines through Jesus, that his clothes become like light. And a voice comes down, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Take everything that you think you know about what it means to be the covenant community and begin again. This is a message that happens through love, through peace, through reconciliation. And my friends, when we read this story, the thing that we are to understand, as Paul so often talks about, is Jesus is the first fruits of new creation. Jesus goes before us so that in and through Jesus, as we come after, that same glory, that same manifestation of heaven can shine through us. That same light. This is my Son, the beloved. And as Jesus would qualify, you are the beloved. You are the covenant community. When I was thinking about a way to close this, to really emphasize that point, that you are the beloved, I came back to a well-known bumper sticker verse from the book of Romans in chapter 8:28. And so often the way that we translate this verse is, for God works all things out for the good of those who love him, those who've been called according to his purposes, right? Is that familiar? God works out all things for the good of those who love God. Some verses will say, all things work out for good for those who love God, those who've been called according to his purpose. We've translated that verse that way for hundreds of years. And in some ways, it's just kind of become a copy of like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, to where we don't even really question it anymore. In the last few decades, there's been some brilliant biblical translation scholarship that has stepped forward, and this is one of the major verses that they've tackled, because it's actually not correct. And the reason is you can't parse the verb sernege to co-work. God, co-works, or sernege is where we get like synergy. You can't take sernege and have it work with an inanimate object. In fact, nowhere in ancient Greek do we see that verb agreement work that way. Whether it's in Scripture or whether it's in Herodotus or the Iliad or the Odyssey or anywhere like that, you never see that word sernege working with one animate object and another inanimate object, let alone the idea that all things work together, the idea of it's panta, all things. Panta as a plural inanimate object can't work with another panta inanimate object. And so through this work of understanding, we've been misunderstanding, I should say, what the subject is, what the direct object is, how do you place that together? Because Greek, to be honest, is just a quagmire of where words are put, and you've got to understand word agreement and association to be able to really unpack it. But the way that we have come to understand, quite frankly, the way that it fits within the larger scope of Romans is to read it this way. For God co-works with those whom he loves, or those who love him, those whom have been called according to his purposes, for the good of all things. You see, we're not the recipients of that good. We are those who would be the distributors of that good, or the catalysts of that good. And how we can understand Paul's use of those who've been called according to his purpose is beloved. God works with the beloved. God co-works with the beloved. Those whom have been called, those who he has called according to his purposes. And I love this because there's this reflexive in those who love God. This two-way love at the center of that relationship is love. God's love for us and our love for God. And from that comes the tov, that restoring good. Again, it's not just the good of the nations, but it harkens back to that Genesis understanding of tov, completeness, healing, restoration, reconciliation, on and on, every other shun you can think of, again and again and again, of God taking all that's been broken and healing it from the inside out. And so that question, who do people say that I am? Or that more specific, who do you say I am? Who we say Jesus is greatly affects how we understand who we are. And so to spend time with that, asking that question, recognizing that we live in a very divided church, in a very divided nation, and in a very divided world. That question is incredibly important. Who do you say I am? who do you understand yourselves?